Good morning, New Start. So we are Kristin and Jason Engler, and we are super excited to be sitting in front of you today and to have the opportunity to share our story. I want to, add on to what Des said. If you're new to New Start, please be sure to fill out the cards. We just started attending 6 weeks ago, and now we're up here, and they actually do a draw. Okay, that's not really true. So before I get started, I just wanted to share a moment that Jason and I had prior to this. It's a little nerve-wracking, right, getting in front and speaking of a bunch of people. So yesterday we had to come in and practice, and believe it or not, the thought of practicing in front of our pastoral staff was a little more overwhelming than talking in front of all of you. So we said a prayer together, and as I'm in the middle of prayer, I actually was praying to move away the anxiety and the fear and the nervousness, and I said, as we prepare to speak in front of people who love us. Okay, now that I say that out loud, it sounds really dumb, and it actually happened. God just tapped us on our shoulder and reminded us. So I guess I just say that to encourage you. If you'd asked us 5 or 6 years ago if we would be sitting up in front of the church, we didn't even know we'd be in each other's lives, much less talking to you about what an amazing journey it's been. So keep open to God's blessings. He can do so much. So if you're joining us for the first time in this series, this is the second week in a 4-week series on marriage. Jason and I are following David Mabry, who last week spoke to us about the idea of a purposeful marriage. Let marriage be held in honor among all, Hebrews 13:4. David walked us through how marriage is purposeful, but today Jason and I are going to present a bit of a different scenario, and that is, what happens if there's a death of a marriage? We are not advocating divorce by any means. There are folks that are concerned that ministering to blended families or remarriage actually condones or encourages divorce, or that somehow if you're ministering to the remarriage that it is the equivalent of abandoning God's design for marriage, and that is not at all true. We uphold God's ideal, one man and one woman until death do we part. What this ministry about is helping remarried couples and stepfamilies walk hand in hand with Jesus in their present. The challenges of stepfamily life are a distraction from what really matters, and that is Christ at the center of your relationship and your family, and an opportunity to show what a covenant, Christ-honoring marriage is to your kids. The enemy's goal is to leave you feeling discouraged and defeated in that goal, and less than those around you, and perhaps not good enough for God's grace. So I'd like to share a bit of a reading with you that speaks into that brokenness. Nina was at home with her 4 children, none of them older than 5, one of them only a month old, when her husband called late in the afternoon, telling her to not plan on him for dinner, that he wouldn't be there. Well, how late are you going to be? No, I'm not coming home. You mean you're not coming home tonight? No, Nina, I'm not coming home ever. Talk about the world suddenly not being right. Shattered peace, busted harmony. That's not to say that their 10 years of marriage had been Ken and Barbie perfect. It had grown increasingly difficult in spots, peppered with hurt and disagreement, but never to the point where she'd seriously contemplated 4 kids, no husband, no marriage, no backup, no relief from what those days can do to a mom, even in the best of situations. And yet that's what was left for Nina to deal with, a messed up life in a messed up world, and it was now up to her to fix it. There wasn't anybody else to turn to. Sure, God was there. He'd saved her as a 20-year-old rebel. She'd done her best to keep him placated by her good life, good church-going, and good parenting. But good Lord, there was only so much she could do. And now she was being forced to do it with twice the responsibility and half the stamina. But you do it for your kids, right? You can't quit. Not on them. So you learn to live with the betrayal, the fatigue, the challenges, the self-pity, the long nights, the awkward conversations, the embarrassing questions, all of it. Christianity, and you try to match it up with your Christianity, which makes Christianity just something else to do to your already overblown to-do list. And for Nina, it is quickly becoming too much to do. She sat in a crowded worship service one evening, bravely battling back against the stresses of her life by singing promises she wasn't sure she could believe, much less expect to hope or deserve. Her husband had let her down. Life had let her down. God had let her down. Everything was impossibly wrong, completely out of tune, and in the midst of feeling herself totally unglued that night, fumbling nervously with a paper envelope that had been lying in the seat next to her, she started to fold it and crease it, and for whatever reason, she tore it in half. Tear it more, the Lord seemed to urge her. Tear it into pieces. This wasn't how she usually interacted with God. She was in church here, okay? Couldn't be doing something destructive and distracting, something she'd fuss at her 3-year-old for doing. But whether through obedient response to what she was hearing from him in her spirit, or because of the sheer agitation convulsing in her heart, she quietly began bending that envelope over and over on itself, into quarters, into eighths, and into sixteenths, slowly curling away thin slivers of paper, then tearing them into even tinier shreds, dozens of them, hundreds of them. Now put it back together, she sensed him saying. It won't go back together. But that's what you're trying to do, Nina, isn't it? You're trying to put yourself and your life, your world back together, and it's not going to happen, not without me. And in a deliberate confession of raw faith, Nina held out her palms, elbows extended, and slowly lifted that 2-handed bowl of brokenness up to the Lord in surrender. He was right. She couldn't do it. This mess was his to fix and figure out. And he has. He does.
So this story may be difficult for us to relate to, so let's bring this back to the context of our current situation. So if I could ask you by show of hands, how many of you are or know a single parent? Someone who's been divorced? How about a widow? Remarried? Everybody who knows us has to raise your hand. So those are all just examples of blended families that have experienced a loss and need to know the importance that they're not alone and there's a community that they can plug into. So a little of my backstory, my first marriage ended after 11 years. It produced 2 beautiful children, my oldest daughter, Lily, and my youngest son, Ryan. Unfortunately, I would still come to church and feel just the pressures that this story described, not really understanding where my fit was. Where's God going to put all my broken pieces and my mess back together? It just didn't seem possible. What's next?
So I, too, was married nearly 11 years, and it ended with divorce. I have 2 children, Taylor, 15, and Johnny, 13. I started attending New Start about 6 years ago, and I remember sitting in the church and listening to, Greg preach on marriage and thinking, was that it? Was my divorce the end of what marriage was meant for me? Was I worthy of redemption? Had I failed God?
So as Kristin's story illustrated, seeking to fit in the church is often difficult. There's still a stigma that's carried in as you sit in the audience and understand how you plug in. There's divorce care, but that helps you through the healing process of your loss. But what's next? What's after that? Question was asked in a recent Step Family Summit that we attended. Where do you plug in and how do you offer this and why does this fit in the marriage ministry? And the answer, although seemingly obvious, was, well, you're seeking the lost and you're saving the lost, right? So there's our fit. Remarried people often feel like second-class Christians, but let's be honest, there's no perfect families and there is no second-class Christians or first-class Christians. So let's pull some examples from the Bible and take a look at some. Starting all the way back in the beginning, let's talk about Adam and Eve. Well, from that marriage came Cain and Abel, and Cain killed his brother. So let's not stop there. Let's talk about the family of promise. How about Abraham and Sarah, Jesus' own lineage? Abraham lied to the Egyptians in order to save his life and said Sarah was his sister, disowned her in public, and then left her open to other men. Later, Abraham had a son with another woman who married, while still married to Sarah, to produce the promised child. This became a situation of jealousy when Sarah later had their own child. This is almost a perfect example of all the different emotions that can be experienced in a step family of bitterness, jealousy, anger, loyalty conflicts, most of which, unfortunately, was handed down generation after generation. So let's flip to another story. How about David, a man after God's own heart? Well, he had an affair, then had a woman's husband killed to cover it up, and a child out of wedlock. But he was still in high regard according to God. So God's ideal for a family is evident in Scripture, but an ideal family to imitate is not. So that's where God's mercy and grace can be ushered in. He gives it to us freely. The truth is we're all sinners, and we all have less than perfect lives that we're living, and we all need a Savior. So remarried people and blended families aren't second-class Christians because there are no first-class Christians.
So fast forward that into the context of today's culture, and would it surprise you to know that they've done mathematical analyses and they've determined that there are 72 different combinations of blended families. So those questions we asked you earlier, just a small representation of families that are impacted by that. I would suggest that in some form or another, you all have either been in one or been around someone who's impacted in this way. Would it also surprise you to know that 40% of married couples with children are actually step couples? What about that second and third marriages have a 15 to 25% higher rate of divorce than first marriages? Friends, we're here teaching today because we believe that God has a different plan for remarriage. We believe that with Christ at the center and a community of support, that remarriage can bring redemption to the lives of the people in the marriage and to their families. We are confident that as a church, we have an opportunity to reach blended families where they are and to bring them to Christ. I want to introduce an illustration to you that has been quite meaningful for both Jason and I, and that is the idea of God as our potter and us as the clay. A wise potter knows how to make beautiful things out of clay, but a really good potter often will incorporate dust from broken pots into his pottery. This dust is called grog. The grog actually has to be shattered just right. If it's shattered too finely, then it doesn't add any stability to the new clay or to the new pot. If it's not shattered enough and it's too coarse, then it will make the master potter's hands bleed. Wow, you get a little bit of that analogy there, right? If we allow God as our master potter to mix our dust with his living water, what an amazing story and a beautiful image that he can create. Oh, no, it's still me, sorry. I was trying to turn it over to him. So, bring this back to us. As we mentioned, Jason and Kristin Engler, we were married in June of 2017. It's been about 2.5 years since we were married, but we're going to walk you through something that we blended families like to call step family math. And the way that works is that you take the number of kids that you have, 4 for us, times the number of years that you've been married, and that means that we will soon be celebrating our 12-year anniversary. And I'm just going to say, trust me, in the context of a blended family, it makes sense.
So we were very optimistic as we rolled into our new relationship and often found that disillusionment was very normal for others in our situation. You think that you can just walk away from your past and that now that you have 2 parents to basically parent your children that it's going to be better, right? So let's turn to a story of Exodus, of a very hard journey and a very long journey. The Israelites repeatedly lost sight of God's faithfulness and protective hand. They grumbled, complained, they were afraid, angry. The journey was challenging, difficult, and there was lots of uncertainty, and they just couldn't see the other side to where God was leading them. This journey for us is very much like a remarriage or a blended family. God's doing all the hard work, and we may not always see it at first. We have to trust and place our confidence in him. And like the Israelites, he will give us what we need for the day, and he will deliver us to the promised land. The hardship and challenges of remarried and blended families are unique and challenging, and it's why we need God at the center. Just like the Israelites, we can't see the end, so we have to trust in the provisions we receive every day. The reality is the honeymoon period is not at the beginning, unfortunately, it's the end in a remarriage situation. Hard starts almost immediately. We may not see it at first, but God has a plan and sees a bigger picture. We can't see the outcomes, so we have to trust. So I'd like to introduce you to a visual representation of a step family. This is going to be a step family genogram. There we go. This is not a real family that I know of anyway. But let me walk you through this. This is important because it really highlights a lot of the complexities and the challenges that just aren't a part of a traditional marriage. So from right to left, we've got Sarah and John, once married, 3 children, Mary, Alex, and John Jr. We have Bob and Sally, once married, now divorced, and they had 2 children, Billy and Sue. Fast forward, you've got Sam and Sally remarried, Bob and Sarah are now remarried, step family, and John is a single parent. All of the circles and squares above that are all the complexities of previous divorced families that were then part of the parents' family. So now you have multiple sets of step parents, grandparents, and basically an extended family. This illustration really kind of walks through where the traditional marriage and parenting studies are good, but they just don't have a lens towards these complexities. they miss the challenges of blended family. So we'd like to share just a few of these examples and help you understand why people need community and support to help navigate through this.
So before I jump into the challenges, you all saw the beautiful picture of the 6 of us standing there smiling. I think we missed it, but Aaron, can you cue the funny one?
That's real.
That's what our family really looks like most days. And I also have to share that there was not any situation or picture that we could post that made all 4 children happy, so someone is unhappy with this picture. Okay, you can go back to the genogram. So, divorce doesn't end family life. It actually reorganizes it. The 2 of you, you and your ex-spouse, might end up in different households, but you're still a parenting team. And I promise that can present a significant amount of challenges. What about the fact that you only get your kids a percentage of the time? And that really depends on whatever your agreement ends up at. But based on that, you have to figure out your schedule challenges for things like family activities, activities with the kids. What about just time between you and your new spouse? Those things can become very difficult. Well, what about control over the other household? Well, you don't have any. So their rules and responsibility, all the things that they ask the children to do, that's not something you get to have any say over. And then what about beliefs? You might be a family that preaches and talks about Christ at the center, but if the other home isn't, there's nothing you can do about that. The only thing that you can do is to continue to model Christ and what you want the children to walk away with in your own home. And that is a blessing, and yet sometimes can create a lot of stress and high pressure when the kids are all with you. What about the new step-parent relationship? Do you walk into the marriage and all of a sudden have authority over your new stepkids? No, that doesn't happen. It means that it's that much more critical that you act as a parenting team and that the biological parent takes the lead in that relationship, and until the authority is achieved by the step-parent, you two have to be communicating and working together and in agreement with one another. What if your spouse questions your heart or motive in a disciplinary decision as it relates to your kids versus theirs? Does it mean that they don't love or trust you? No, it means that they're human and that this is hard. And it's just that much more critical that the 2 of you are with Christ at the center. There's a study that we do that actually references the idea of you 2 getting behind the wall, and it puts everything else, including the kids, on the other side. You 2 need to remain as one. So what about loyalty conflicts and tug of war? And I'm talking through all these squiggly lines. So in this case, I want to say it's the blue lines, but all the relationship dynamics that exist. So loyalty conflicts, tug of war, they exist in a lot of different ways in a step family. What about how parents who are remarried can feel about their own children and the time that they used to spend that was singled out and it was just them with their kids, and now all of a sudden they have the dynamic of a new spouse and new kids to compete with that? What about children? How might they feel in a new relationship like this? Well, one, they used to have all the time they wanted with their biological parent, and it was all to themselves. Sometimes their other biological parent, feels threatened by the new step-parent or speaks poorly of them. As a child, how does that feel? Do you feel the permission then to like your new step-parent, even if it is someone that you love? Oftentimes, kids can actually be jealous of the new spouse of their parent. So we each had 2 kids, and one of the things that was a bit of a challenge for us was, sounds funny, but I fit a kid on either side. What happens when your new spouse is here? That was actually a challenge. Who holds both hands? Those things are things that you don't think about, but that you have to work through, and they have emotional repercussions as well. And what if the new step-parent wants to create a relationship or get to know their new stepchild? Are you then creating jealousy from your own child in the time that you're taking away from them? What about this idea of loss of role or place? This is actually something that I would think a lot of folks in this church can understand. As we all moved together into one building, we blended as 2 families. And there were folks that had jobs at their old church that either were duplicated here or in some circumstances are no longer available. And so you're seeking for where your new fit is in the church. We actually have a really good example of that in our family. Johnny was the youngest in his previous family, and Lily was the oldest. They came together, and now they're the middle children, oftentimes confused as twins, and they're not. But they had to figure that out between the two. What do they do? What about maintaining old traditions while still establishing new? So remember, you come into this family, and you have a lot of different traditions and things that you've been doing as your previous family, and you don't want to cut all that off because it's too much for the kids. So one of the things that we have to do is take separate activity days together, or even vacations apart from one another, but as two families of three. That means that you can still nurture the biological relationships, and then hopefully it helps to better integrate the family of 6. It may not make any sense for a biological family, but it makes perfect sense in the context of a blended family. What about holidays and traditions for those? Well, we actually have 3 Christmases just for the 6 of us. We have one with 2 kids and then one with 2 kids so that we can maintain all the things and traditions that we used to do. But then we've created a family of 6 where we do a secret Santa that everybody gets really excited about, and we're working on new traditions. So with all of this, you still have to maintain marriage as the center of your relationship. There's one complexity to that I really haven't mentioned yet, and that is that in a standard Christian marriage, a biological marriage, the children come after the marriage. In a remarriage, the children come before. So those biological relationships predate the marriage. And that oftentimes actually means that the marital relationship is the weakest in the home. I want to take this back to the idea of God as the potter and us as the clay. God's promise of restoration and redemption is not on our timeline. Oftentimes, we can't see past all of these difficulties and hardships and challenges, and we can't see past the broken. But we have to believe that God's plan is bigger, and it's beyond our view, and we have to trust that every day God will give us just what we need to get through that day, and know that his plan for restoration is real.
So let's bring this back to God's promise and the promised land in the story that we just illustrated. Remember, the honeymoon period is at the end of a blended family, and you have to get through all those difficulties and challenges. And we've only highlighted a handful, I promise. Pretend, though, in all of this, you still have all of the normal complexities and challenges of life. You have work schedules, financial stresses, health issues, right? All the normal crazy schedules of 4 teenagers playing 4 different sports and being everywhere, right? It's overwhelming. Remember, step families are born out of the loss of a previous relationship, regardless of how they were formed, whether it be through death, divorce, out of wedlock births. That loss is a journey. It's not a destination. And God can put all of our broken pieces back together. It takes time, and we have to trust him. So God can take the dust and make it into something more beautiful, pulling back from the illustration we discussed. So what are some of the needs of a blended family? These are just a couple of the highlights of lessons learned that we've experienced. So learning to love like Christ. In a step family, you have to choose love intentionally, daily. We chose each other in love, and we now have stepchildren and extended step families, ex-husbands, wife-in-laws, extended grandparents. It's complicated, right? You have to choose love, even though it's not reciprocated in all circumstances. Learning to love, to let go of the past. As Scripture reminds us, perfect love casts out all fear. You may be in a world of hurt when you bring 2 families together in a remarriage, but you have to let God do his redeeming work in you to be who he calls you to be. His redeeming work in you is who he calls you in this new marriage. Learning how to communicate and navigate through conflict. Pause there for a moment. In a step family, the same stumbling blocks exist in a marriage. They also exist here. So learning how to communicate well, learning how to navigate through that conflict is critical. We have a marriage ministry designed to teach just that. It's critical for remarriage and step families due to the complexities we've talked about, but it's just as important in first marriages. If you weren't aware, New Start has trained marriage coaches and experienced mentors to come alongside you and support you in these different areas. Learning how to connect in a Christ-centered community is probably the game changer for us. So Kristin and I experienced so much growth and encouragement through our small group and our Blended and Blessed group. We think it's a critical piece of the church that sometimes they don't know how to offer it. So on May 9th, New Start, we're going to be hosting an event to kind of bring those resources in the community and other churches that are interested to an understanding of this so that they can be too equipped and navigate this and love on the people that are in these blended family situations. What does true redemption and restoration through a kingdom marriage look like? So by living out God's ideal on earth and modeling for our kids God's plan for marriage, we can play an active role in breaking the generational cycle of divorce. This is personal to us since we're both products of divorce. It creates an opportunity to show God's true plan for marriage. It creates a blessing beyond anything we deserve. And to us, a kingdom marriage demonstrates the power and true redemption and restoration through Christ. I'm going to read from Isaiah 61, 1 through 4. This is actually our group's life verse, and I'll pull out a piece that really hit home for all of us. Thanks, Aaron. The Spirit of Sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim that captives will be released and prisoners will be freed. He has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favor has come, and with it, the day of God's anger against their enemies. To all who mourn in Israel, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. In their righteousness, they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for his glory. They will rebuild the ancient ruins, repairing cities destroyed long ago. They will revive them, though they have been deserted for many generations. And really, the piece that really soaked on our hearts as a group was beauty from ashes in that. So spiritual rebuilding requires the removal of obstacles, and God seeks to repair all the brokenness in our lives and place his stamp on our hearts so we can reflect his image. As Peter writes in 1 Peter 5:10, and after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. These 4 words describe how God is mending our brokenness and repairing our hearts, strengthening our souls. Our Father is a God of restoration. He is a God of redemption. Simply put, our relationship with Christ is what redeems us in a relationship of trust and faith for life as a whole.
The band can go ahead and come back up. Beauty from ashes, God's promise to send his only Son to restore us. Friends, marriage is purposeful. Remarriage is just as purposeful. Even with the added challenges that we have, we must empty ourselves for Christ, pursue each other through Christ, with Christ at the center. Jason and I have asked ourselves this countless times, but how do people get through anything in life, much less the challenges of a remarried family? So why are Jason and I passionate about remarriage? Go ahead and put the pots up for us. Because remarriage, just like any covenant kingdom marriage, is a witness and representation to others and to our kids of what God's promise and his promise of redemption is in our own lives. God doesn't reject broken vessels. He restores them and uses them for his glory. Something amazing happens when we give our brokenness to Jesus. He takes the pieces and makes us whole. For us, this is an opportunity at redeeming our family legacy, and with Christ in us, helping others along that very same redemption journey. Thank you for listening to us today. This is Greg.